The crack of the rifle shot was a physical blow, a sound so violent it seemed to tear the very fabric of the afternoon sky. Wood splintered from the stagecoach frame, a razor-sharp shard flying past Felicity Woodrow's cheek. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the thunder of hooves wasn't a distant rumble, but a deafening immediate storm surrounding them. The coach lurched, throwing the passengers against one another in a tangle of limbs and terrified gasps. "They're on us," the driver's voice was a ragged shout from above. "Hold on." Another shot echoed, this one closer, followed by the high-pitched scream of a horse. The coach pitched violently to one side, its momentum failing, and ground to a halt in a cloud of choking red dust. Felicity clutched the worn velvet of the seat, her knuckles white. Beside her, a portly salesman in a sweat-stained suit was muttering prayers, his face ashen. The doors were wrenched open. Masked riders, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, loomed in the openings, their pistols leveled. The air inside the coach grew thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and gunpowder. "Out, everyone, out now," a gruff voice commanded. They scrambled out into the blinding Arizona sun, hands raised. Felicity's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the chaos. There were 5 of them, their horses circling nervously, kicking up dust that clung to everything. They moved with a practiced efficiency, one man keeping the driver and his shotgun guard covered, while the others systematically relieved the passengers of their valuables. The salesman surrendered his wallet and a gold watch with a trembling hand. A woman sobbed as a ring was pulled from her finger. Felicity had nothing of value. Her purse contained only a few dollars, barely enough to see her through her first days in Silver Creek. A rider with cold, dark eyes, visible above his bandana, stopped in front of her. His gaze swept over her simple, travel-worn dress, lingering for a moment on the delicate silver locket that rested at the hollow of her throat. It was her most precious possession, a final gift from her mother, containing a tiny, faded portrait of the woman she barely remembered. "What's this?" the man rasped, his gloved fingers reaching for it. "Please," Felicity whispered, her voice cracking. "It has no value. It was my mother's." He ignored her plea. His fingers were rough as he fumbled with the clasp. When it wouldn't open, he gave a frustrated grunt and simply tore the chain from her neck. The delicate silver links bit into her skin before snapping. He held the locket in his palm for a moment, weighing it before stuffing it into his saddlebag. The violation was more profound than any theft of money. He had stolen a piece of her past, a tangible link to a life that already felt 1,000 miles away. The leader of the group barked an order. In an instant, the riders were back on their horses. With a final taunting whoop, they spurred their mounts and galloped away, melting into the shimmering heat haze of the desert, as if they were never there. They left behind a terrified silence, broken only by the woman's quiet sobs and the labored breathing of the injured horse. Felicity's hand went to her throat, her fingers tracing the raw red line where the locket had been. She was alive, but something essential had been taken from her. This was her welcome to the West, a land as cruel and unforgiving as the sun that beat down upon it. By the time the crippled stagecoach limped into Silver Creek, the sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the barren landscape. The town was little more than a single dusty artery, flanked by weathered wooden buildings that sagged as if weary of their own existence. The sun had baked the very soul out of the land, leaving cracked earth and splintered wood. From the saloon, a piano clanked out a tune that sounded like a drunkard stumbling down a staircase, a mournful, disjointed melody that seemed to be the town's official anthem. Shadows in the alleyways clung like secrets deep and dark. Felicity stepped down the dust, immediately settling on the hem of her skirt like a shroud. She clutched her worn carpetbag, the only belonging the bandits had left her. Her trunk, containing the last vestiges of her former life, was meant to follow. But now she wondered if she would ever see it again. No one was waiting to greet her. No one stood on the boardwalk to welcome the mail-order bride of Mr. Edmund Blackwell, the wealthy mine owner who was supposed to be her future, her salvation. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, slurred with whiskey, but sharp with desperation. "He's a rich man, Felicity. He'll pay off the debts. You'll have a good life, a respectable life." A respectable life purchased and paid for like a sack of flour. This contract, this arranged marriage to a man she'd never met, had been her only escape from the ruin her father had left behind in Boston. Now standing alone in the dying light of this desolate town, she felt the full weight of her transaction. She was property, and her owner hadn't even bothered to collect her. "End of the line." "Miss," the driver called down his face grim. "Mr. Blackwell, send someone for you." He was supposed to. Felicity replied, her voice barely a whisper. She scanned the nearly empty street, her gaze catching on the faded sign for the Blackwell Mining Career office at the far end of town. A chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air traced a path down her spine. "Well, I can't wait around. Gotta see to this horse." The driver tipped his hat, his sympathy as dry as the dust at their feet. "Good luck to you, miss." Before she could protest, he was gone, leaving her utterly alone. She took a tentative step toward the boarding house, its sign creaking in the evening breeze, when the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, spilling raucous laughter and 3 lurching figures onto the street. Their laughter died when they spotted her, a lone woman silhouetted against the twilight. One of them, a man with a wild beard and stained clothes, grinned, revealing a landscape of missing teeth. Well, look what the stage dragged in. Felicity's heart began its frantic hammering once more. She clutched her bag tighter, taking a step back, but there was nowhere to go. They closed in their intentions, clear in their leering expressions, so the stench of cheap whiskey rolling off them in waves. "You lost pretty thing," one of them slurred, reaching for her. She flinched away. "I am here to meet Mr. Blackwell," she said, forcing a steadiness into her voice that she did not feel. The men exchanged glances, and the leader let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Blackwell, Edmund Blackwell." "Yes." "Do you know where I might find him?" "Oh, we know him." "All right," the man said, his eyes narrowing with a cruel amusement. "Fact is, sweetheart, you're a little late for the wedding. Blackwell's dead. Been dead 3 weeks now. Mining accident." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The dust beneath her feet seemed to dissolve the world, tilting on its axis. Dead. The one solid fact upon which her entire future had been built had just crumbled into nothing. That cannot be true," she stammered. "True as I'm standing here," the man said, his grin widening as he saw her composure shatter. He reached for her arm again, his grip surprisingly strong. "But don't you worry. Now that you're free of your commitments, we can take real good care of you." Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She was trapped, her back against the rough-hewn wall of the general store. The men closing in their faces, distorted masks of predatory hunger. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Felicity squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the inevitable, when a voice cut through the tense air, as sharp and clean as breaking glass. "I believe the lady isn't interested in your company, gentlemen." The men grunted, turning. Felicity opened her eyes and peered around them to see a tall figure standing in the middle of the street, silhouetted against the last bloody remnants of the sunset. He stepped forward into the dim light spilling from the saloon, and she could make out his features, a strong jawline, shadowed with stubble-weathered skin and eyes that seemed to burn with a quiet intensity. He wore a long duster coat over a simple shirt, a worn Stetson casting his face in shadow. At his hip, a Colt revolver rested in its holster, looking less like an accessory and more like an extension of the man himself. "This ain't your business, Lawson." The leader of the drunks spat, though his bravado had lost its edge. "I'm making it my business," the stranger replied. His voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. His hand rested casually near the butt of his gun, but there was nothing casual about his stance. It was the posture of a man who had faced down trouble before and had no doubt about the outcome. For a long-stretched moment, the air crackled with the potential for violence. Then, with a curse, the leader spat in the dust and shoved his companions back toward the saloon. "Come on, boys. She ain't worth the trouble." As they stumbled away, Felicity released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding her knees threatening to buckle. The stranger Lawson approached her with deliberate steps, as if she were a spooked mare. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "Yes. Thank you." She managed her own voice, a fragile thread. Is it true what they said about Mr. Blackwell?" A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something that looked like weary resignation. "I'm afraid so. Edmund Blackwell was killed in a cave-in at his mine 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing." The finality in his tone extinguished the last ember of hope. Her arranged marriage, her only prospect, was gone. She was stranded, a stranger, in a strange town with no money, no connections, and night falling like a curtain. "I'm Lucas Lawson," the man said, breaking the heavy silence. "Town Marshal, Felicity Woodrow," she replied automatically. I came here to marry Blackwell." He finished for her, a hint of sympathy in his tone. "You're not the first mail-order bride to arrive out here to a surprise. Still, it's a hard welcome." She fought back the tears that burned at the back of her eyes. She would not break down in front of this stranger, Marshal, or not? "Is there a hotel, a boarding house, where I might stay while I figure things out?" Lucas nodded. "Mrs. Peterson's boarding house is just down the way. She's a good woman." He hesitated, his gaze assessing her worn dress and the small carpet bag. "Do you have funds for a room?" The question stung her pride, but it was a fair one. Some, she admitted, knowing it wouldn't last more than a night or two. He seemed to read the truth in her face. "Come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let's see what Mrs. Peterson can do for you." With no other options, Felicity followed him. The boarding house was a neat 2-story building set back from the main street. A plump, middle-aged woman with kind, weary eyes answered the door. "Evening, Marshal," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze fell on Felicity, taking in her disheveled state. "Mrs. Peterson, this is Miss Felicity Woodrow," Lucas explained. "She arrived on today's stage. She was contracted to marry Edmund Blackwell." The woman's face fell in a mask of genuine sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in out of the dust." Inside, the boarding house was clean and smelled of baking bread and beeswax. As Mrs. Peterson bustled about making tea, Lucas explained Felicity's situation. "Of course she can stay," the woman declared, waving a hand dismissively at Felicity's mention of payment. "We'll work something out. I could always use help around here." Relief so potent it was dizzying washed over Felicity. It was a temporary reprieve, but for now it was enough. Lucas rose to leave. "I'll check in on you tomorrow, Miss Woodrow. See what can be done." As he turned, Felicity's hand shot out, catching his arm. "Thank you, Marshal Lawson. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Something flickered in his eyes, concern perhaps, or something deeper. "Just doing my job, ma'am. Get some rest." Things have a habit of looking different in the morning. After he left, Mrs. Peterson showed Felicity to a small but spotless room at the back of the house. Once the door was closed, the facade she had so carefully maintained finally crumbled. She sank onto the narrow bed and allowed the tears to come silent sobs that shook her entire body. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a dead man, only to find herself alone and destitute in a town where violence was a casual greeting. The silver locket was gone. Her future was gone. All she had left was the kindness of strangers, and in a place like Silver Creek, she wondered how long that could possibly last. The next morning, Felicity woke to the jarring reality of her situation. After a restless night, she dressed and made her way downstairs, determined to project an image of composure. She found Mrs. Peterson in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. The older woman's kindness was a comforting balm, but it was tinged with a weary caution that spoke volumes about life in Silver Creek. "The whole town's been on edge since Blackwell's death," Mrs. Peterson confided as she kneaded dough with practiced hands. "He wasn't a well-liked man, but his mine is the lifeblood of this place. Now no one's sure what will happen." Felicity's plan, if it could be called that, was simple and desperate. She had to see for herself. She had to go to the Blackwell Mining Company office and confirm the truth. Perhaps there was a mistake. Perhaps there was some provision, some small sum set aside for her travel and trouble. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one she had. She found the office at the end of the street, a stark, unadorned building that seemed to absorb the morning heat. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The interior was cool and dark. A man stood behind a large oak desk, his back to her, studying a map on the wall. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the town outside. When he turned, Felicity felt a jolt of surprise. He was handsome, with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair combed neatly into place. But his eyes were as cold and gray as river stones. "May I help you?" He asked, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was entirely out of place in this rough-hewn town. I am looking for Mr. Blackwell." Felicity said, her voice small. A flicker of something practiced sympathy, perhaps, crossed his face. He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. You must be Miss Woodrow. I am Silas Croft, the mine foreman. Or I suppose the acting manager now." Felicity sank into the chair, her hopes withering under his cool gaze. "Then it's true Mr. Blackwell is gone. An unfortunate mining accident, I'm afraid." Croft said, his words smooth and rehearsed. "A terrible tragedy. He was a great visionary." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "I understand you had an arrangement with him." The contract, his question was casual, but it felt probing, as if he were an entomologist examining a new specimen. "Yes, I traveled from Boston. All that way for such a tragic outcome," he murmured, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked in the quiet room. "I am truly sorry for your predicament, Miss Woodrow. Stranded so far from home." His sympathy felt hollow, a performance for her benefit. "Did your contract make any provision for such an eventuality?" I don't know," Felicity admitted, feeling foolish and naive. "My father made the arrangements." "I see." Croft steepled his fingers, his gaze intense. "Well, you will find Silver Creek a difficult place for a woman on her own. There are very few opportunities for respectable employment." The words were a statement of fact, but they carried the subtle weight of a threat. He was dismissing her, assessing her as a problem to be managed. This was her inciting incident. The last fragile thread of her arranged future had been definitively severed. She was not a bride-to-be. She was a complication. And the man sitting across from her with his unnerving charm and cold eyes was not an ally. He was an obstacle, a powerful one. "I will manage," Felicity said, rising to her feet, her own voice surprising her with its newfound steel. She would not be intimidated. She would not be dismissed. Croft's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I admire your spirit, Miss Woodrow. But spirit doesn't put food on the table. Should you find yourself in need of assistance, do not hesitate to call on me. The Blackwell mine always looks after its own." The implied offer hung in the air, cloying and sinister. He was offering charity, but what he wanted was control. Felicity turned and walked out of the office, her back straight, leaving Silas Croft to his maps and his secrets. The mystery of Edmund Blackwell's death had just become intensely personal. Felicity walked out into the harsh sunlight, her encounter with Croft leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She felt lost, a ghost, haunting a life that was never meant to be hers. As she stood hesitating on the boardwalk, the three drunks from the previous night emerged from the saloon, their eyes lighting up with malicious recognition. "Looky here, boys. The little bride's all alone again. Their leader sneered, blocking her path. Before she could react, Marshal Lawson was there. He didn't run or shout. He simply materialized at her side, a solid, reassuring presence. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He looked at the three men, his gaze flat and hard, and the air grew heavy. "We've had this conversation," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is the last time we'll have it." There was no threat of violence in his words, but a promise of it. The drunks seemed to shrink under his gaze. With mumbled apologies, they scurried away, melting back into the shadows of the saloon. Lucas turned to Felicity, his expression softening. "You all right?" He saw the look on her face and nodded toward the mine office. "You met Croft." It wasn't a question. "He told me the mine accident was a tragedy," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Croft has a polished way of saying things." Lucas replied, his tone grim. His eyes held hers for a moment, and she saw a flicker of something not just sympathy, but something akin to recognition or perhaps suspicion. What did he want? He wanted to know about my contract. He offered his assistance. I'll bet he did. Lucas muttered. "Stay away from him, Miss Woodrow. Silas Croft is a man who only helps people when it helps himself." Her first and most pressing obstacle was finding work. Over the next 2 days, she discovered the truth in Croft's warning. The general store owner politely informed her he had no need for help. The hotel manager was equally dismissive. Felicity couldn't prove it, but she felt Croft's influence like a cold shadow, subtly blocking her attempts to secure her independence, trying to force her into the dependency he had offered. Her last hope was the town's doctor, a cynical, world-weary man named Wilson, whose office was a chaotic mess of papers and medical texts. He looked her over with skeptical eyes. "Marshall sent you, did?" Dr. Wilson grumbled, gesturing to a desk piled high with disorganized ledgers. "Says you can read and write and keep accounts." "I've heard that before." "I can," Felicity said firmly. "I taught bookkeeping at a school in Boston." He grunted, pushing a dusty ledger toward her. "Prove it. Organize this mess. I'll pay you for the day. If you're any good, we can talk about something more permanent." It was an act of defiance. By taking the job, she was refusing to be the helpless victim Croft wanted her to be. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work the meticulous task of bringing order to the chaos, a welcome distraction. She was no longer Felicity Woodrow, the failed mail-order bride. She was a woman fighting for her own survival. The days bled into a week. Felicity found a quiet rhythm in the dusty office of Dr. Wilson, her world shrinking to columns of figures and handwritten patient notes. But as she meticulously organized the doctor's records, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Tucked away in a box of old files, she found the official reports for several miners who had died at the Blackwell mine over the past year. The causes of death were all listed as accidents, falls equipment malfunctions, cave-ins. But the details were sparse, and the descriptions almost identical, as if copied from a template. Edmund Blackwell's report was the same accidental death due to tunnel collapse. It felt too neat, too clean. Deeper in the box, she found a small, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a medical book. It was filled with Blackwell's spidery handwriting lists of names next to sums of money and coded entries. One phrase appeared repeatedly next to several names, "past debts settled." The final entry, dated the day before his death, was a single cryptic line. "The Boston package arrives soon. Leverage confirmed. The old score will be settled at last." A cold dread washed over her. She was the Boston package. Meanwhile, Lucas was conducting his own quiet investigation. The official story of the cave-in didn't sit right with him. He'd been a lawman long enough to know the difference between tragedy and foul play. 2 of the miners who had been on shift with Blackwell had vanished the day after his death, their wages uncollected. The third, a young man named Billy, was still in town, but he was jumpy as a rabbit, his eyes wide with a terror he refused to name. Their shared purpose began to draw Felicity and Lucas together. The evenings on Mrs. Peterson's porch were no longer just polite chats. They became strategy sessions. Cautiously at first then, with growing trust, they shared what they had discovered. "These reports," Felicity said one evening, her voice low as she showed him her notes, "they're all too similar." Dr. Wilson signed them, but he admitted he rarely went up to the mine himself. He took the foreman's word for it. Croft's word Lucas corrected his expression, hardening. He was the foreman then, too. He was the one who found the body. Lucas in turn told her about the missing miners. "Billy's scared," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "He saw something. I know he did. But Croft has him terrified." During these quiet conversations, the wall around Lucas began to crumble. One night as they spoke of Blackwell's ruthlessness, his focus drifted. He stared into the distance, his jaw tight. Felicity watched as a haunted look shadowed his eyes. He was seeing something else, something from his past. "Lucas," she asked gently. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Sorry, Blackwell. He reminds me of a man I once knew. A case from years ago before I came to Silver Creek. A businessman named Abernathy ruined dozens of families with a land scheme. He was smart, ruthless. Slipped right through my fingers. I never forgot it. It was the first time he'd spoken of his life before, and the failure clearly still stung. Their investigation drew them closer, forging a bond of respect and shared determination. The initial spark of attraction between them deepened into something more substantial, a quiet understanding that grew in the space between spoken words. At the same time, Silas Croft watched them. Felicity would sometimes catch his eye as she walked through town, his cool, appraising gaze sending a shiver down her spine. He would offer a polite nod, a charming smile, but she could feel the menace beneath the surface. Once she saw him standing outside the mine office, staring at a small, faded photograph he held in his hand, his expression one of cold, calculating hatred. He was a patient predator, and she and Lucas were treading ever closer to his web. A month after Felicity's arrival, a thin, nervous-looking lawyer named Mr. Jenkins arrived from Tucson. The town buzzed with speculation about the fate of the Blackwell mine. Felicity assumed it had nothing to do with her. She was a footnote in Edmund Blackwell's story, a loose end. She was wrong. Mr. Jenkins summoned her to his room at the hotel. Lucas, sensing her trepidation, insisted on accompanying her. The lawyer perched on the edge of his chair and, clutching a leather portfolio, cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Woodrow," he began, "I am here to execute the last will and testament of Mr. Edmund Blackwell. It contains a rather unusual provision." He opened the portfolio and produced a document. Mr. Blackwell's will specifies that should he die before his contracted bride arrived, she was to inherit his personal property, namely, the cabin and the 50 acres of land on which it sits. The news hit the small hotel room like a thunderclap. Felicity stared at him, speechless. Lucas's hand came to rest protectively on her shoulder. I don't understand," Felicity finally managed. "We never met. He didn't even know my name." "I cannot speak to his motivations," Madam Jenkins said, adjusting his spectacles. "I can only execute his wishes. The property is legally yours." The news spread through Silver Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Before they had even returned to the boarding house, Silas Croft was waiting for them on the street. His charming facade had cracked, revealing the cold ambition beneath. "Miss Woodrow," he said, his voice tight, "I have just heard the most astonishing news. I must congratulate you on your good fortune." The words were polite, but his eyes were chips of ice. "The company would of course be prepared to purchase the land from you. For a very generous sum, say $500. It was a staggering amount of money, more than she had ever seen. But the way he said it, The avarice glittering in his eyes made it feel less like an offer and more like a threat. "That's very generous, Mr. Croft," Lucas said, stepping slightly in front of Felicity. "But Miss Woodrow will need time to consider her options." Croft's gaze shifted to Lucas, and the pretense of charm vanished completely. "This doesn't concern you, Marshall. Anything that concerns Miss Woodrow concerns me," Lucas replied, his voice level. Felicity found her voice. "I need time to think," she said, echoing Lucas. Croft's smile was a thin, cruel line. "Of course. But don't take too long, Miss Woodrow. Land out here can be unpredictable. Fires, rock slides. It would be a shame for such a valuable asset to be damaged." The threat was unmistakable. As he turned and walked away, Felicity felt a profound shift. She was no longer just a stranded woman piecing together a mystery. She was the owner of something Silas Croft desperately wanted. The land itself was the key. She had just been elevated from a person of interest to the primary target, and the stakes of this deadly game were no longer just about survival. They were about a fortune hidden somewhere in that dusty, rock-strewn patch of land. The accidents began 2 days later. An ore cart from the mine, its brake line mysteriously severed, came careening down the main street, jumping the tracks and smashing into the wall of the general store, mere feet from where Felicity was standing. Lucas pulled her out of the way, just in time, his arms a steel band around her. The next night, a fire broke out in the shed behind Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, the flames licking dangerously close to the main building before the town's bucket brigade could extinguish them. The point of origin was a pile of oil-soaked rags left near the wall just below Felicity's window. There were no more veiled threats from Croft, just a relentless, terrifying campaign of intimidation. Lucas's protection became constant. He moved from the marshal's office into one of Mrs. Peterson's spare rooms, his presence a silent shield. But they both knew it wasn't a solution. Croft was trying to scare her into selling, and his methods would only escalate. "We have to find out what's on that land," Lucas said grimly one evening. "That's the only way to beat him. We need proof." Under the cover of darkness, he took her to the inherited cabin. The small, sturdy structure felt different now, imbued with a sinister significance. While Lucas stood guard outside, Felicity searched within her hands, running over the rough-hewn furniture, searching for anything Blackwell might have hidden. In the base of a heavy stone fireplace, she found a loose stone. Behind it was a small locked strongbox. Lucas forced it open with the tip of his knife. Inside, nestled amongst deeds and geological surveys, was a small leather-bound journal. It was Blackwell's. They sat at the rough wooden table, a single lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls, and read. The journal was a testament to a man consumed by greed and revenge. Page after page detailed his betrayal of a business partner years ago in the gold fields of California. Blackwell had discovered a rich vein on land they were prospecting together. He'd falsified the claim papers, then engineered a rock slide that had left his partner, a man named Marcus Croft, for dead. Blackwell had fled with the stolen claim, using the fortune it generated to build his empire in Silver Creek. Felicity's blood ran cold. Marcus Croft, Lucas's face was a grim mask. "Abernathy," he breathed. "The man I told you about. The one who got away. His real name was Marcus Croft. He changed it after he survived that rock slide and spent years trying to rebuild his life, a ruined man. The pieces of his past and her present slammed together with brutal force. Silas Croft wasn't just a greedy foreman. He was a son, avenging his father. But the journal held one final devastating revelation. In the last few entries, Blackwell wrote of his plan. Marcus Croft, under the name Abernathy, had found some success and was using his influence to ruin Blackwell financially. Blackwell, paranoid and cornered, had devised a counter-scheme. He had learned that Croft had a powerful ally, a federal judge in Boston. The mail-order bride agency was his tool. He had instructed them to find him a bride from a specific well-regarded Boston family, a family with known ties to that very same judge. Felicity stared at the page, her own name, or rather, her family's name, the Woodrows of Beacon Hill, written in Blackwell's spidery script. The sickening certainty crashed down upon her. She was never meant to be a bride. She was a pawn. Blackwell had brought her to Silver Creek to use as leverage against his old enemy, a shield or a weapon, in a war she knew nothing about. She had escaped one man's debts, only to be purchased as ammunition by another. The sandstorm hit without warning, a monstrous, roiling wall of red dust that swallowed the sky and choked the sun. It descended upon Silver Creek like a biblical plague, shrieking through the streets, rattling windows, and sealing the town in an impenetrable, suffocating shroud. All travel ceased. The telegraph line went dead. The town was an island, isolated and alone. It was the perfect stage for a final act. Croft made reckless by the storm, and the belief that Felicity now possessed the one thing that could expose him, Blackwell's journal, decided to make his move. He found her in the saloon where she and many of the townspeople had taken refuge from the storm's fury. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and whiskey, the howl of the wind, a constant unnerving counterpoint to the nervous murmurs inside. Croft cornered her near the back of the room. His usual impeccable appearance was gone, his hair wild, his suit dusted with red grit. The mask of civility had been completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, obsessive hunger for vengeance. "You have it, don't you?" he hissed, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Blackwell's journal. I know you were at the cabin." Felicity's heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," he snarled, grabbing her arm. "That land, that mine, it was all stolen from my father. Blackwell left him to die in a collapsed mine just like the one I left him in." It was poetic justice. Just then, the batwing doors flew open, and Lucas stood there, his duster whipping around him, the storm raging at his back. He moved through the saloon with a calm, deadly purpose, his eyes locked on Croft. "Let her go, Croft." Croft laughed, a harsh grating sound. He didn't release Felicity, instead pulling her closer, using her as a shield. "Always the hero, aren't you, Marshall? You know we've met before." He turned his venomous gaze on Lucas. "A long time ago. My father's name was Marcus Croft. You might remember him as Abernathy. And you were the lawman who let him get away with it. The great Marshall Lawson who couldn't piece together a simple case of fraud and attempted murder. My father lost everything because of your incompetence." The revelation struck Lucas like a physical blow. This wasn't just about justice for Felicity. It was about his own past failure, a ghost that had haunted him for years, now standing before him in the flesh. This vendetta was a twisted triangle, binding all three of them together. "My father died a broken man because of what Blackwell did and what you failed to do." Croft spat, his sanity fraying. "I've spent my life planning this, reclaiming what is mine. Blackwell's death was only the beginning." He tightened his grip on Felicity. And she was supposed to be the final, beautiful irony. He looked down at Felicity, a cruel sneer on his face. "Did you know, my dear, your fiancé had such plans for you? He knew my father had a powerful friend in Boston, a Judge Albright, a man whose reputation was his life. A man with a secret weakness for his niece. A young woman whose family, the Woodrows, he had helped out of financial ruin more than once." He paused, letting the final piece fall into place. Blackwell didn't want a wife. He wanted a hostage. Your arrival was meant to be the checkmate in his little game. He was going to use you to blackmail the judge, to ruin my father all over again. You see, you were never anything more than a weapon in a war between two greedy old men. The world seemed to spin around Felicity. She was a pawn traded and used by everyone. Her father, Blackwell Croft. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear that had paralyzed her was burned away by a clean, cold rage. She would not be a weapon. She would not be a victim. Croft was distracted, gloating, his focus split between her and Lucas. His grip on her arm had loosened slightly. Felicity's eyes darted around the saloon. A heavy whiskey bottle sat on the table beside them. Croft was monologuing, savoring his moment of triumph. It all would have worked perfectly, he was saying to Lucas, if this little piece of property hadn't decided to become a problem. That was her chance. With a cry of fury, Felicity drove her heel down hard on Croft's instep. He roared in pain, his grip faltering for a split second. It was all the opening she needed. She wrenched free, grabbed the heavy whiskey bottle, and swung it with all her might, smashing it against the side of Croft's head. He staggered back, stunned blood mixing with the dust on his face. The moment of surprise was all Lucas needed. He lunged forward, not for his gun, but for the man. The fight was brutal and short, a clash of two men driven by years of grief and guilt. It ended with Croft on the floor, Lucas's pistol finally in his hand, aimed squarely at the man's chest. The storm howled outside, a wild applause for the justice that had finally violently come to Silver Creek. In the quiet aftermath, when the storm had passed and a fragile, clean light washed over the town, Silver Creek began to pick up the pieces. The wind had scoured the street, leaving it unnaturally clean, as if the town itself had been given a chance to start anew. Lucas and Felicity sat on the porch of the boarding house, the silence between them. Comfortable, not empty. They were no longer just a lawman and a victim, but two survivors, irrevocably bound by the ordeal they had shared. The raw emotions of the saloon had been replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Lucas finally broke the silence, his voice low and rough. He told her the full story of the Abernathy case, the details he had kept locked away for years. He spoke of his youthful arrogance, his frustration at being outmaneuvered by a clever criminal, and the guilt that had driven him west, seeking a simpler form of justice he could understand and enforce. When you arrived, he confessed, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, and I learned you were tied to Blackwell. It felt like a second chance. A chance to fix the mistake that had haunted me. My need to protect you, Felicity, it was tangled up in my need for redemption. I'm sorry if I wasn't honest about that. And Felicity reached out and placed her hand over his. You have nothing to be sorry for, Lucas. You saved my life. She looked down at her own hands, twisting in her lap. All my life I have been a pawn, used by my father to maintain a facade of wealth, sold to Blackwell to pay his debts, brought here to be a weapon, targeted by Croft to reclaim a legacy. I don't think anyone has ever seen me as just me. Her voice was thick with unshed tears, but her eyes were clear. It was a moment of raw, painful honesty. They were two damaged people, their pasts littered with ghosts and regrets. But here, in the quiet morning after the storm, they were choosing to build a future together. A future based not on circumstance or necessity, but on the simple, unvarnished truth of who they were. They had faced the worst of their pasts and had survived. Now all that was left was what came next. Weeks later, a semblance of normalcy had returned to Silver Creek. Silas Croft was gone, handed over to federal marshals to face trial for murder and a litany of other crimes. The future of the Blackwell mine was placed in the hands of the town council, who planned to run it as a community trust, ensuring its profits would benefit the town that depended on it. Felicity, with a unanimous vote from the council, was officially appointed the town's school teacher. She found a deep satisfaction in the work in the bright, eager faces of her students. It was a purpose she had chosen, a life she was building with her own hands. She and Lucas decided to keep the cabin. They spent weekends there, clearing away the last vestiges of Edmund Blackwell's presence, airing out the ghosts, and slowly, deliberately making it their own. It was no longer a place of secrets and danger, but a sanctuary, a promise of the future. One cool evening, as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the desert sky bleed into shades of violet, and Rose Lucas handed her a small cloth-wrapped package. "I found this among Croft's effects when I was cleaning out his office," he said quietly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside, resting on the soft cloth, was her silver locket. It was tarnished, and the chain was broken, but it was whole. She clicked it open. The tiny, faded portrait of her mother stared back at her, a gentle smile on her face. It was a relic from a past she had left behind, a life of obligation and sorrow. She held it for a long moment, a symbol of the journey that had brought her here. Then she closed it, the soft click echoing in the twilight. She looked up from the locket in her hand and out at the vast, open landscape stretching before them. The land that had once seemed so threatening, so alien, now held a different meaning. It was no longer a symbol of isolation or danger, but of freedom, of endless possibility. Lucas came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. He didn't look at her or at the locket. His gaze followed hers out toward the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. They stood there together, two solitary figures against the immense beauty of the world, not looking back at the past they had survived, but looking forward at the future they would build by their own choice together.